Okay, from the real First World War to stumbles in emerging economies and a church grappling with modernization. The agenda's Week in Review begins with Daily Beast contributing editor David Frum on who's the better president for Canada. David, start us off. Let's just get everybody's position on the record here. Who's better for Canada?
I think Romney pretty clearly, and not just because he's more likely to accelerate American economic growth faster than President Obama will, which of course is good for Canada, but I would direct people's attention to two things. The first is President Obama has been very emphatic about his desire to tax American corporations that make big investments abroad. He wants to change American tax laws in ways that would discourage American investment in other countries and encourage American investment in the United States. Well, the biggest single recipient of American investment is, of course, Canada. So Canada would be the main target of this approach of President Obama's. And the second is, of course, Canada is on its way to becoming one of the world's great energy suppliers, hydrocarbon energy. And if you have a distrust of hydrocarbon energy, as President Obama does, that's going to be bad news for Canada, which has oil sands to develop and which has natural gas to frack for a global market. It's just Canada is not big enough to consume the energy it produces, and it doesn't have the investment resources to finance the energy it could produce.
Sheila Copps, who's better for Canada?
Well, obviously, I believe that Barack Obama is better for Canada because the policies that he have are clearly directed towards ordinary people. If you listen to David's exposition of why we should support his opponent, it's basically to help big business, big business. And I think that what Obama offers is the kind of balance that hopefully will reflect north of the border. When you're looking at, for example, the whole issue of energy consumption and a tripartite or a bilateral agreement on energy, you need to have enough conditions in place to make sure that we have sustainable environment. We can't just simply go ahead and do what's good for big business is good for us. And I think, you know, Mitt Romney's already written off 47% of the population, and that doesn't make for good government north or south of the border.
Theo, who's better for Canada?
It's the economy, Steve. And if that's what you think is the most important issue, and David alluded to this, then you have to pick Mitt Romney, no question about it. It is axiomatic that Canada and the United States enjoy the largest bilateral trading relationship in the history of planet Earth. And the American consumer represents 70% of the U.S. economy, 20% of the world's economy. And in Canada, we export stuff. We have lots of stuff, rocks, trees, skies, seas, and we send it elsewhere to be sold. We should fall on our faces in this country of Canada every day and thank God that we are positioned where we are with the stuff we have right next to the largest consumer market in history. That pertains to Romney in as much as Republicans, generally speaking, are free traders. They understand that. They understand the value of countries trading with one another and of having, as much as is possible, a free and open trade relationship. David alluded a bit to this when he talked about Obama's desire to discourage international investment on behalf of Americans. Romney understands the value of the trading relationship as it pertains to energy, as David mentioned, and elsewhere. And in general terms, he knows that the trading relationship between Canada and the United States is vital to the interests of both countries. And beholden as he is to organized labor in the United States and other interests, you don't see the same from Obama. It's an open and shut case. It's Mitt Romney.
Alex, you're batting cleanup.
Well, you know, there's my preference, which is, you know, I would prefer the worldview of the Obama administration if it were up to me. And I think if you ask Canadians as well, both Barack Obama, who's an exceedingly popular world leader in the opinion of Canadians, but also the democratic positioning that he represents, is something that Canadians are probably more likely to be aligned with than a Republican administration. But I would hasten to add, you know, one of the important things to consider here is what happens in a transition. The Canadian government has built up relations with hundreds of senior administration officials. There's a relationship which has helped us avoid Buy American provisions. And there's also the fact that the Keystone XL pipeline is assumed to be going ahead under by many under a Democratic administration. I don't think we can get caught up in the ideological differences as much as we have to bear in mind the relationship. And in the midst of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, for instance, which Canada has worked so hard on, you have to question what happens with a new administration. All that work has to start over again. And so I think people need to be careful about what they wish for on the right.
Although it took place 2.5 centuries ago, the consequences of the French and Indian War are still with us today. With more on this, we welcome on the line from Boston, Massachusetts, William Fowler. He's the author of Empires at War, The 7 Years' War, and the Struggle for North America. What was the actual spark that lit the fuse that led to this war?
Well, it was, of course, that rambunctious that young, colonel from the Virginia militia named George Washington. The spark that set this was a land dispute. The French claimed land west of the Alleghenies. Keep in mind the geography here that French Canada and then French Louisiana were connected by a river and lake system. And so the French claimed the land in the west through the Ohio Valley in that region. And the people of Pennsylvania, and particularly Virginia, also claimed that land. The royal governor of Virginia, a man named Robert Dinwiddie, dispatched young Washington west to warn the French out of what the French had just established a fort at the junction of the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers at a place they called Fort Duquesne. And so Washington had been dispatched then to send the French away. In the course of his expedition to the west and a variety of rather complex things that happened, Washington and the Virginia militia attacked, and I do mean this, attacked without provocation, a French party, ambushed them, as the French would say, killed several French soldiers. And that was the spark that set this world ablaze. That was in 1754. It actually takes 2 more years for the war to be officially declared in Europe, hence the difference, by the way, between the European and American point of view. We call it the French and Indian War. In Europe, they often call it the 7 Years' War, even though it started in 1754, and you can do the arithmetic for that. But it was Washington and the Virginia militia that provoked the French. It's not to say that the war might not have started in any case. The tinder was piled pretty high. It only took a spark. Washington struck that spark.
Professor, I'm going to read an excerpt from your book here on what was clearly the most important battle in this war for Canada, and that was fought in 1759 on the Plains of Abraham. And here's the quote. General Wolfe stood with his men. He ordered them to load 2 musket balls at a time and hold their fire. When the French were only 40 yards away, officers and NCOs behind the British line ordered, "Present," and then fired. Thousands of lead balls tore through the French center. Men fell in windrows. The redcoats reloaded and advanced steadily. As he advanced with the grenadiers, a musket ball slammed into Wolfe's right wrist. Wolfe wrapped the wound and pushed on. The enemy signed him again. This time, he took a ball in the stomach and another in the breast. He crumbled to the ground. While Wolfe lay dying, the battle continued to rage. Montcalm rode to the front, presenting a perfect target astride his black charger. The Marquis was hit several times. The doctor told him he would be dead by morning, to which the Marquis responded, "Good, I will not see the English in Quebec." This was a battle in which the French and the British each lost 650 dead. The French marched out of Quebec City. All these years later, 253 years later, what would you say the overarching significance of this battle was?
It's one of the epic battles in world history, not in size or scale or number of men involved, but it's a battle that decided the fate of North America. And it's a battle that decided, indeed, the fate of the British Empire. It was decisive in a way that few battles are decisive. It also, of course, because of the extraordinary romance surrounding the death of the 2 commanders in this magnificent fashion, has lived down through history. The dying words of Montcalm, the dying words of Wolfe. They have become national heroes. National heroes, by the way, both in Canada, certainly, and in Great Britain as well. And so over the last 200 plus years, we've come to revere them. Very brave men. I think one must admire in this kind of engagement where the commanders themselves go to the front of their lines. I think we would have fewer wars if the generals had to lead at the front of the lines.
I'd like to get your take on whether you agree with those economists who say that at some point over the next decade, China is going to surpass the United States as the world's largest economy. What do you think?
Yes, and the most revealing part of that statement is how the crossover date, if you will, has been brought forward by as much as a decade, as far as the latest estimates have it. It used to be 2050, then it was 2030, and then 2020. I've seen a recent estimate putting it as close as 2017. But let's not get too excited about it. China has a lot of people, for it to become a larger economy in growth terms is almost inevitable as long as growth keeps up. But China's still a poor economy on a per capita basis. Chinese citizens are much less affluent than Americans or Europeans or Canadians. And that's in some ways a more important factor than just the aggregate size of the economy.
And just finally, what would you say the likelihood is of the Chinese economy not slowing down gingerly, but rather having a hard landing at some point in the next year or two?
Less than 50%, not a zero probability. There is room for a lot of things to go wrong, particularly if the world economy goes into an even deeper funk, which makes it more difficult for China to effect the transition to domestic demand growth. Basically, what the Chinese have to forestall a hard landing is its domestic firepower, fiscal stimulus and some monetary stimulus. But that's a very dangerous tool to use because a lot of that spending could be wasteful and could simply store up problems for the future. So the soft landing is as much dependent on the state of the world economy as it is on sensible and thoughtful intervention on the part of Chinese authorities.
I want to play you a clip at this stage, if I can, which is of Claremont McKenna College's Min-Shin Pei, whom I'm sure you know, whom we had on this program earlier this year talking about crony capitalism. So listen to this clip, and then we'll come back with a question. Roll tape, please.
Once China joined the WTO, China's foreign trade grew tremendously, and China's growth rate accelerated. And that took off the pressure for economic reform. In China, when you look at its history, economic reform accelerates only when there is a lot of external and internal pressure. In other words, crisis leads to reform, growth hampers reform.
So the question becomes, does China need a crisis in order to spur on economic reform today?
We should all hope and pray that there isn't a crisis in China. And while crises perhaps have good outcomes in retrospect, one should always look for reform through periods of relative stability. It's not correct to say that the period of rapid growth post-WTO entry did not bring about any reform. Indeed, I would argue somewhat the contrary. WTO entry put in place a system of economic liberalization and reform of economic freedoms, particularly personal economic freedoms, that precisely has paved the way for the kind of personal calls for greater liberties in spaces outside of the economic sphere. If you have the ability to choose how you spend your money and where you travel for your holidays and what job you take up, you will also want to have views on the newspapers you read and what you see in the official press, and ultimately on who represents you at the township or the village or the national level. So WTO entry and the reforms, the economic reforms that were ushered in as a result of WTO entry were an important contributor to the reform process. Some of that has stalled, I don't deny it, but there's no question that we saw reform take place through the 2000s period.
India is expected to add 130 million people in the age demographic of 20 to 49 over the next 15 years. 130 million people aged 20 to 49 over the next 15 years, that according to the United Nations. The conventional wisdom might be, oh my God, is there a way that could work in India's favor?
I think very much so. And I think, again, not to be sort of, starry-eyed about this, because the demographic dividend and the demographic bulge that you're going to see in India is actually going to also occur in some of the poorest states, poorest provinces in India. So the dividend is both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is that India, unlike many of the countries in the West, and indeed many of the Asian tigers, including China, South Korea, Japan's already there, is not an aging country. So India will continue to be young. And therefore, the view is amongst Indian policymakers that if they get this side of the equation right, that is providing opportunities for the demographic bulge, not only will it serve India's needs, but indeed it could serve the world's needs in the coming 20, 25, 30 years. That's the opportunity side of it. The challenge side of it is that, as I said, most of this growth is taking place in the poorest of Indian states. And therefore, how you make these changes and facilitate entry of these young people into the labor force becomes one of the topmost policy challenges.
Sure. Where do you see the jobs coming from?
So I think here, the current model of sort of depending or over-dependence on the service sector is unsustainable. And therefore, the changes that will have to take place are in the manufacturing side. And the policy statement, now we'll see how it translates into reality in the coming year, but the reason for optimism is it's the first explicit statement by the government of India to move the manufacturing share of the economy from roughly about a sixth to about a fourth in the coming 10 years. So that is 100 million jobs to create over the next 10 to 15 years.
But that requires they get all those other aspects right.
Which means that the infrastructure aspect needs to take place. It can't happen just by government, so you're going to look at public-private partnerships, you're going to look at more foreign entrants, and then concomitantly, you're going to look at the soft infrastructure, which is the, think of it as the education training side of it. An Indian government document about 5 years ago, and it's now starting to make its way through the policy process, wants to quintuple its expenditure on higher education, both sort of for high-end research, access, training, all of those kinds of things. And that's where you're going to see the combination of, if you will, soft infrastructure and hard infrastructure coming into greater convergence in the coming years.
Ontario will receive 15 new seats in the proposed redrawing of the federal electoral map. More seats is better, right? Well, not so fast. Others are concerned about losing their voice or sharing a voice with parts of a riding with which they have nothing in common. Sean Ibbotson, I want to bring you in first because there are any number of ways the House of Commons could have gone on this to kind of rectify this problem. You could have more seats, as they've chosen to do. You could have the same number of seats and just decide that politicians are going to represent a lot more people. Or you could take seats away from places that currently have them to get the balance right. They decided to add 15 new seats from Ontario. How come?
Well, essentially, Steve, they had no choice. The need for the seats was acute. We were getting a House of Commons that was becoming more and more unfairly skewed in favor of rural ridings and regional ridings, where a voter in Prince Edward Island the ballot was as equivalent to 3 or 4 voters in Greater Toronto or outside Vancouver. So there needed to be some kind of return to representation by population where votes counted more fairly. Unfortunately, the Constitution and laws that were passed since the Constitution makes it impossible to reduce the number of seats. Smaller provinces, especially Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland and other provinces generally, are more or less guaranteed that the number of seats that once they get a seat, they get to keep it forever. So you can't take seats away from Prince Edward Island and give them to Ontario. It would be nice if you could, but you can't. The only way in which to return Ontario to something like its fair representation in the House is to grow the House for Ontario and for BC and for Alberta. And because Quebec, as part of this incredibly arcane formula, always has to have a percentage in the House of Commons similar to its population, they got 3 seats too. I know it's incredibly complicated, and no one wants to see the House getting bigger. No one wants to see more politicians and more of a budget, but there was simply no other way to do it.
The addition of 15 seats in Ontario, does that solve the problem Parliament set out to solve?
Well, it helps have a more equal representation by population, but I do want to come back to something John said at the beginning. He said it was not possible to take away seats from smaller provinces. It's true that it was not possible to take away seats from Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick because of provisions in the Constitution that are absolutely entrenched. But if Parliament had wanted to take away seats from other smaller provinces, it could have done that. And I think the government has been very skillful in saying that it had no choice. But in fact, they did have a choice. and they chose to add many more seats to the House of Commons than was absolutely necessary.
Can you give me a for instance? They could have...
Manitoba and Saskatchewan could have lost seats. Nova Scotia could have lost at least one seat. Newfoundland and Labrador could have lost one. I think there's a lot of people out there who don't think we need 30 new MPs, 15 from Ontario, and maybe we'll have 15 more MPPs in Ontario as a result of this if the province decides to keep the same boundaries. So I think the Commission is actually going to hear quite a bit about people are going to say, why do we need more politicians? Well, and the judge is going to say, it's not our fault. We didn't do it.
Let me get some feedback from John Ibbitson on that, because John, I'm guessing the reality is it's a hell of a lot easier to add stuff than take stuff away, right? Politically speaking.
Well, it's a fascinating supposition from Professor Sanctit, but as he points out, the political reality in this case would be that you would be protecting seats in the Maritimes and stripping seats in the prairies. Not all the seats would be protected to be in the Maritimes, and not all the seats that would be protected to be in the prairies, but the upshot would be just horrible, horrible optics, in which Manitoba voters and Saskatchewan voters would quite reasonably ask, why are we losing our representation in the House of Commons and Prince Edward Island is keeping theirs? And the answer would have to be, well, there's nothing we can do about it. So I think remember, this bill went through 3 or 4 iterations before it finally passed. It was incredibly difficult. There was a lot of opposition to it within the rural caucuses of the governing Conservative Party too. But it had to be done. And one thing we haven't raised, Steve, and I think needs to be raised, the Mowat Centre raised it. It has to be done for reasons that come uncomfortably close to the question of racism. The fact is, these small rural ridings in all the provinces are largely populated by the settler population, the descendants of the original settlers who came here from Europe. These grossly underrepresented ridings in and around Toronto and Vancouver and other big cities tend to have large immigrant populations. No one intended it to be that way. No one intended to disenfranchise immigrant voters. But once you point that out and say, look, this riding in Vaughan, it has 4 times the population of a riding in Prince Edward Island, and they happen to be mostly South Asian or East Asian, and you do nothing about that, and then another year passes and you do nothing about that. Every year you don't do something about it, it becomes increasingly a question of why are you stripping immigrant voters of their rights while protecting the rights of voters in places like Prince Edward Island. That's why the government had to act.
Michael, do you agree there is a kind of a racial angle here that needs to be probed?
Yeah, I mean, I think what John hinted at was that if there is, it's unintended. But there's always been urban underrepresentation in Canada, but it's changed because of immigration from Asia and Africa. And the fastest growing regions of the country are in Ontario, Alberta, and BC, in the suburbs around Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto. So those are if you're going to overrepresent somebody, and groups always would like to be overrepresented when they go and speak to the boundary commissions, you have to underrepresent somebody. And the people you're underrepresenting are visible minority suburban voters. And I think we have to ask ourselves, does the political system serve those voters well? I think we should have some doubts about that. And so there's extra impetus to try to make sure their votes count for what they should count, which is the same as everybody else's.
Ontario hasn't said anything yet, Michael, about whether or not it will mimic what the feds are doing. Should they?
Ontario provincially has to do something, because if you're in Oak Ridge's Markham, you have 230,000 people compared to around 110,000 in many other ridings in the province. That's an unconstitutional deviation. That's a big problem if your vote is worth half or less in Oak Ridge's Markham. So Ontario has to do something. And the problem with what the provincial government did, which is decouple the provincial ridings from the federal ridings, is we now don't know what the process is. So is it going to be done by the legislature? Is it going to be done by an independent, nonpartisan commission? Is the government going to make sure it happens now, at a similar timing to the federal boundaries? We don't know all of that, and the risk is if nothing happens, we have a very serious underrepresentation for all those very populous ridings.
Laura, should the government of Ontario simply say, whatever the feds come up with, sign us up too?
I think it would be worth their while to think it over carefully, but I think in the end they're going to have to move in that direction, and there will be a certain amount of convenience for the riding associations, but there will be also a certain amount of difficulty at the first election after this happens, where you're going to have candidates deciding where they want to run.
John, what do you say on that?
I think Ontario should move for the very same reason. Right now, parts of Ontario are underrepresented in the legislature. I covered Queen's Park for 6 years, and one of the things that's chronic at Queen's Park is that the government of Ontario is perpetually at war with the City of Toronto. It's in the government of Ontario's interest to be seen to be at war with Toronto because it plays well in places like, well, where I grew up, Muskoka, and rural parts of Ontario, any part of Ontario that isn't Toronto or isn't GTA. And that's wrong. The GTA is hugely important to the province, and that huge importance should be reflected accurately in the legislature. So it's just right and proper, as well as good policy, for the Ontario government to put into Queen's Park proper rep by pop so that the Toronto and the GTA get their rightful representation.
Andrew, is it a tough sell when you're operating with a $14.8 billion deficit to say we need 15 more politicians at Queen's Park?
Yeah, we already got 15 more MPs. Now the provincial government's being pressured by everybody here to say, yeah, we should have 15 more MPPs. I think it's a very hard sell. So I think the government of Ontario is in a tough spot on this one.
So would you say they should just stick with the current boundaries and not go to 121?
On balance, I guess I think it's probably best if they do follow the federal boundaries, but that's just one more reason why I think it's a bad idea that Ontario, that everybody got more seats, or that the fast-growing provinces got more seats.
Sounds, Michael, like it would take a courageous politician to say, deficits be damned, 0% contract increases be damned, we're going to create 15 new jobs for 15 new politicians. Is that a tough sell?
It's absolutely a tough sell. And federally, you know, they didn't maybe face the exact same deficit issues, but it was also a tough sell federally. And the government decided to do it because otherwise, how can you ensure that federal government would be responsive to voters? So the Ontario government has to do it for the same reasons. And if it doesn't, I think very soon after will be some kind of constitutional litigation trying to compel the government, saying it's against the right to vote in Section 3 of the Charter, unless you need to draw boundaries of similar populations. And right now they're totally out of whack, and that has to change somehow. So it's not attractive to the government to add more MPPs, but they're going to have to do it, I think.
I want to find out, from a personal perspective, what it was like to live as a Catholic 50 years ago.
Well, I actually,
and where were you?
I was at university. So, you know, listening to this about old men and whatever. So I was a young person at university studying law.
Which one?
Glasgow University,
okay.
Yeah. And we were actually excited. Those of us who were Catholic, I mean, it really kind of bypassed the rest of the students there in that particular country, I would say that. But I didn't think of them as old men, that kind of somehow demeaning approach. We thought it was a wonderful opportunity. I didn't know that much about theology then, but even then we were having all these discussions. So much of it centered around ethics, even although I didn't know I was going to be a bioethicist at that point either. But the whole, I think our whole approach was, there is something going on here, and not only that, it's these people who are sometimes really highly criticized for being conservative, etc., and they sometimes are, I think, in a good way also too. But they're the ones who are bringing this shift. They're the ones who are actually making this happen. They're the ones who actually are opening the window. And it's true. I mean, I think once that begins to happen, even at that young age, I think we realize that you don't go back then. I mean, this was definitely the church propelling itself, and we thought it was
You weren't
exciting.
alive yet, right?
I was. I had just graduated from JK and moved into kindergarten when it concluded in 1965. But I do remember the Latin Mass. My older brothers were all altar boys, and I remember them coming out and, you know, going basically down with their foreheads on the hard brick right before the altar.
Do that.
Yeah, they did that. And they
I was an altar boy at that time, and I didn't do it.
Well, we had very good soon. But then I remember the shift to the non-Latin Mass, to the English Mass.
And what about your dad?
Well, my dad was at the council. He was a periti and helped draft Gaudium et Spes. He was the editor-in-chief of Sheed and Ward publications, as well as the founding editor of Orbis Books. And he had studied with the Jesuits for 11 years and was 1 year away from ordination when he became a publisher. So he was there, and of course the only other language he was fluent in was Latin. So he begins to speak in Latin, and one of the Dutch bishops interrupts him and said, "We're all very impressed with the eloquence of Mr. Sharper's Latin, but would you please speak English?" All that education but it was a very exciting time, and I mean, everyone I've talked to who was participating in the council, the theologians of that period, it was a very bracing, energizing moment.
Meg, how about for you?
Well, I grew up in a very typically Irish Catholic home in Scotland. And, you know, we Mass on Sunday, devotions on Sunday evening. But I also remember my first year at university, it was a Catholic university, so we had to study 2 courses in theology. And I remember the theology professor standing on the podium with 2 books. On one hand, he had the Bible, and on the other hand, he had the documents of Vatican II. And this was just a couple of years after the council. So we were reading these documents, and he was this person, and we cut the energy. Another thing I remember is my Catholic identity changed from what I experienced growing up in the Catholic house. Well, you know, my older uncles were altar boys, and I was very jealous because I wanted to be an altar server and I couldn't. And anyway, but even when I was in high school, priests coming to the young people and saying, "We want you to run this thing in the church for us." And I found that incredibly exciting, that I was being asked to take a role in my church.
That hadn't happened before.
Hadn't happened before.
Okay. Father?
I had just learned enough Latin to serve at Mass, and it wasn't exactly 50 years ago, it was about 48 years ago, and they changed the Mass. And I remember at 7, I was very, very ticked off that I just got it all through. But I think I had a totally different experience. I grew up in a Catholic home. I didn't grow up in a Catholic school until much later, in elementary school. Didn't go to a Catholic high school. We were a minority group. I knew very few people who practiced their faith outside of Catholics. It was already becoming a post-Christian society. And certainly by the time I went to university, very few Catholics practiced their faith at university here in London. And they took the chapel and they went down to about 1/5 of the size, and it wasn't usually filled on Sunday mornings. So I saw a different kind of reality. I saw where basically teachers were floundering, trying to teach a religion that didn't seem to really connect with a lot of people in school. And that was my experience. So I guess it was, as you mentioned earlier, I think that for non-Catholics, it sort of went right by them. You know, it really did. For ourselves, the biggest change for us was the English Mass, big change.
For sure.
And a big change because we lost a lot of priests. We lost a lot of priests, we lost a lot of sisters who I liked as a child.
You lost a lot because?
They left.
They left at that time.
They didn't want the changes.
They just,
I don't think
they didn't
They were
at
the
all.
liberal ones.
Quite the opposite.
The contradiction is people think, you know,
the most liberal left.
Yeah, the most liberal.
I wouldn't say I'm from a very conservative diocese at all. I didn't know much outside of it, but I would say that, gee, it seemed like all the priests and sisters that I really liked, the ones that were cool, and they left.
Okay, hang on, I don't get this though. This is a liberalizing that takes place in the church, and you're saying the most liberal.
Yeah, it's a contradiction in terms. It's one of the big paradoxes of the council.
Moira McQueen from St. Michael's College, U of T. Father Tom Lynch from St. Mary's Parish in Lindsay, Ontario. Margaret Lavin from Regis College and U of T on the other side of the table with Stephen Bede Sharper, co-editor of The Natural City. Thanks so much, everybody. And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, or through iTunes, or on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.